right. Okay. All right. Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. Welcome to the event hosted by United Against War and Militarism, as well as other organizations that are present. So we're really excited. My name's Anna. This is Alonso and Christian. I'll be introducing them a little bit later. I just wanted to give a little overview. Kind of the purpose of this event is really to have primarily an open discussion and forum where we can really break through the various media narratives that we're hearing about this war in Ukraine, particularly about the U.S.'s role in provoking this war and escalating it further and bringing us closer and closer to the brink of nuclear war and destruction. So unlike the media narratives, this war is really not black and white. Despite what they'll tell you, it's possible to not be pro-Russia or pro-West democracy. Christian is in particular going to talk a little bit about that, about the expansion of NATO, and so on and so forth. So yeah, just in that vein, we really want to discuss the complexities of this war, but most importantly, we want to really talk about how to chart our course forward against this war and all U.S. wars, and really think through the various strengths and weaknesses of past movements in this country against the war in Vietnam, against the invasion in Iraq, and so on and so forth. So we'll be going through their presentations and then opening it up. So we're really looking forward to hearing what others think, and there's other people here from other organizations who are also doing work on this, so I look forward to hearing their ideas as well. So with that, I'm going to introduce both of our speakers. So Christian Sorensen is an independent researcher focused on the military-industrial complex. He's an Air Force veteran, an author of the book Understanding the War Industry, and is currently on sabbatical from the Eisenhower Media Network, an organization of independent national security experts. His work is available at warindustrymuster.com. And we have Alonso, who is an organizer with United Against War and Militarism. He was very key and involved in protests at MIT against the university's links to the war machine and its propping up of various war criminals like Henry Kissinger. So with that, I think Christian has some slides, and we'll go from there.
Who is perfect? Okay. My name's Christian. Study the Pentagon's contracts. They come out every day around 5 o'clock. And over time, I've assembled a little bit of knowledge about who's profiting from war. And I will get going, and then my friend on the slides. Yes! Oh! All right, military-industrial complex in Eastern Europe. Next slide, please. If I am speaking too softly, just gesture and I will adjust. All right, so what is the war industry? The war industry is the collection of corporations that develop, market, and sell goods and services to the U.S. military, to U.S. intelligence agencies, and to allied governments, capitalist governments. The war industry is the business of war. Next slide, please. Why deploy military intelligence worldwide? Number one, to harm governments or threaten governments that chart an independent foreign policy. Washington makes the rules. Number two, to ensure the free flow of natural resources out of the global south and into the hands of multinational corporations. And the third reason why Washington deploys the troops around the world and intelligence around the world is because war is very profitable. It's extremely profitable to the U.S. ruling class. Next slide, please. There are many notable war corporations. You know the big ones: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, L3Harris. Nice. You also need to know Huntington Ingalls, which builds ships. Huntington Ingalls and General Dynamics are the only ones who build big ships. Next one, please. Honeywell, Bose Allen Hamilton, Leidos, Amentum, SAIC, CACI, KBR, Textron. Please study these. Please know these. These are the bad guys. Next slide, please. Asset management firms. Big banks and asset management firms are at the top of the war industry. Top of the war industry. Why? Because they hold most of the stock in these publicly traded war corporations. They hold most of the stock. So they vote most of the shares. That's the key. Next slide, please. Who are these primary institutional stockholders of war corporations stock? BlackRock, State Street's another big one, Wellington. The ones in bold, by the way, are right here in Boston. Something to think about. JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, Wells Fargo, and on and on. Next slide, please. Private equity. Private equity is when you have a handful of super rich people. They put their money together, and then they buy a corporation. They're looking to profit. So they have that corporation, and then they trim it. Sometimes they'll get rid of the working class in that corporation. They'll restructure it, and then they look to sell it later on in order to make a profit. Sometimes they blend it with another corporation. Private equity is all over the war industry. All over the war industry. Next slide, please. The war industry is in every single state, all 50 states. However, it is concentrated in certain locations. Okay? Greater Boston is one of those locations. Another big one is from Northern Virginia through Washington, D.C., and up towards Baltimore. That's a huge one. Huntsville, Alabama, where the rocket program got launched after World War II. Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas is a big one. Denver, Littleton, Centennial, Aurora, Colorado. A bunch of places in Florida, Southern California. Next slide, please. I know I'm going fast, I'm sorry, but we got a lot of territory to cover. How do war corporations present themselves? They present themselves one way, and then reality is completely different. So if you're in the business of war, you're not going to say, hey, we're in the business of war, people are dying, it's a lot of money, but it's awesome. You have to say, we're providing solutions. We're providing solutions. We're helping the government. We are supporting critical programs of national significance. This is like some sick stuff. We're creating jobs. We're job creators. What, you don't want jobs? We're solving the most daunting challenges facing our customers. Yeah, next slide, please. Corporate authority. After World War II, when the permanent warfare state settled down, the Supreme Court slowly but steadily started giving corporations more authority. Next slide, please. This is a list of the Supreme Court decisions that have given corporations more and more authority in our lives. Okay, I won't get into many of them, but the general gist is they loosen up restrictions on campaign funding. They give corporations more corporate personhood. Okay? Right now in the United States, a corporate person, an LLC, has more right than a human person. Next slide, please. Ways the war industry influences federal policy. You know lobbying, okay? You know campaign finance. Another way is to rotate corporate officials into the Pentagon's top offices. So the Pentagon back in the day was run by, I'm hogging all the fans, sorry, was run by career civil servants, okay? Now the Pentagon's top offices are run by career business people who come out of the war industry, they do a couple years in the Pentagon, and then they go back into the war industry, take all the knowledge that they gained on the inside, and put it to corporate profit when they get out. And while they're on the inside, they influence policy to benefit corporate profit. It's the revolving door. You know the revolving door. They also establish media organizations and think tanks in order to put out information that benefits whoever establishes and funds the think tanks and the media organizations. They play the jobs card very well, but their legal teams are so good in the fine print, they never have to come through with all the jobs they promise. So they'll say, 1,400 jobs coming to Fort Worth, Texas. We're Lockheed Martin, we love you, we are job creators. But then all the fine print, there's tons of stipulations. They'll say, if A happens, then we don't have to come through with 100 jobs. If B happens, then we don't have to come through with 200 jobs. So they end up coming through with 100 jobs, and that's it. They play that card very well, but the local politicians either are clueless, or they're in on the game, or they don't care. They're getting paid by the war corporation anyway. Corporations running policy processes within the Pentagon. Next slide, please. So what I see when I study these Pentagon contracts is corporations are now in the Pentagon coming up with policy prescriptions for the Pentagon. It's like an infection, and it just spreads and spreads and spreads. They have no incentive to stop the wars. And these are some of the examples. CACI developing and managing policies and practices for acquisition within the Navy. So CACI stands to benefit from those policies regarding acquisition in the Navy that it is developing and implementing. Yeah. Next slide, please. Cost. You know the costs. Immense pollution, troop death. The U.S. troops, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, marine, guardians who get sent over, they fight, they die, they're crippled mentally, physically. Okay? But the main victim of this whole thing, as you know, are the civilians overseas. Okay? Yes, the troop deaths are tragic, okay? But it's small beans. Small beans? Is that a small beans compared to the hundreds and thousands, millions of people who have died in the last 20 years since 9/11. Pollution, rampant mental illness as a result of living in an economic system that crushes the working class and elevates the greedy. Okay? You don't make it to the top of a corporation, particularly a war corporation, unless you have demonstrated sociopathic tendencies. Okay? Lack of empathy, okay? The ability to dissemble, to dissimulate, to lie. It's pretty messed up. Mass surveillance by government and corporation. These are all the costs of the permanent warfare state in which we live. Next slide. William Hartung puts together a list every year when they're about to come out with the Pentagon budget. Okay? And he did it again this year. The overall cost per year is $1.4 trillion. Okay? He tabulates this whole thing over at tomdispatch.com. So you can see it. He just came out with it last week. Military base budget plus nuclear weaponry. That spending is in the Department of Energy. It's not part of the Department of Defense spending. Plus intelligence spending, black budgets, plus veteran affairs budget, plus the interest on all the debt, okay? Plus the Department of Homeland Security. Okay? All of that together, $1.4 trillion permanent warfare state. They pay for war. The U.S. ruling class pays for wars two ways. Okay? One is with your tax dollars, but the other one is through debt. They sell Treasury marketable securities. That's debt, and they use that to pay for wars as well. So even if the wars end tomorrow, we still have to pay the interest on all that debt. Next slide, please. Eastern Europe. Okay, how am I doing for time? Yes. Yes. All right, Eastern Europe. Next slide, please. So, what was the Pentagon doing in Eastern Europe prior to the end of February of this year, February 2022? Okay. Broad brushstrokes here. Increasing the troop presence, pre-positioned stock, which we'll talk about, building military infrastructure, U.S. and NATO, provocative military exercises, training troops all along Russia's borders, including but not limited to Ukraine, abandoning arms treaties, cyber operations against Russia, even the New York Times mentioned this, and I'll get into that, and sales from the U.S. war industry to every single Eastern European country except for Belarus. Next slide, please. Okay, Caitlin Johnston, I'm sure some of you know, but this quote is excellent, so I'm going to read it. I still can't believe there are grown adults in 2022 who think the U.S. is pouring weapons into a foreign nation because it wants to protect democracy from an evil tyrant who launched a completely unprovoked invasion for no other reason than because he is evil and hates freedom. Yet, that is the narrative that we are presented if you turn on Fox, CNN, MSNBC, if you read much of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and on and on. Okay? She's great, by the way. If you haven't read any of her stuff, please check out her. I think she's on Substack or something. Next slide, please. So pre-position stock. Pre-position stock is all the big stuff you need to fight a war. Okay? The U.S., by the way, never left Europe after the Cold War. Okay? It had many, many troops in Europe during the Cold War. It never left. It reduced some of those troop numbers, but it never left. So it has pre-position stock all across Europe, and it's kept that there. Okay? Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Poland. And it's building a new site in Poland. Next slide, please. There we go. That's where it is. Okay? 360 million pre-position stock site in Poland. According to NATO Secretary General, it's the largest single infrastructure project funded by NATO in the last 3 decades. Okay? Next slide, please. Military construction contracts. I studied the Pentagon's contracts, and the Pentagon doesn't build anything itself, by the way. Okay? It contracts with U.S. corporations and corporations in other countries. It throws them a bone that way in order to build up military infrastructure. Okay? So you see this in the publicly announced contracts. So, in the year or two prior to February 2022, U.S. military construction was happening in Bulgaria, North Macedonia, all the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, okay, Hungary, Romania, and then they come up with these contracts for for broad construction across the continent. So they'll say U.S. Army Corps of Engineers contracts with, in the list, a bunch of corporations for repair, maintenance, infrastructure, new projects, and they won't say specifically where it is, they'll just say across Europe, and it'll usually be a massive contract, several hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes more, and yeah, it'll be over like 5 years or something like that. Next slide, please. Okay, so in addition to all of that, the State Department and the Pentagon signed one-on-one deals with individual European governments to then use their existing infrastructure. Okay? So you have U.S. military infrastructure, you have NATO infrastructure, and then you have the U.S. military using other countries' military infrastructure. So here you have Pompeo and somebody from Poland. I believe that's the defense minister from back in the day. August 2022, Pompeo signs deal to redeploy troops from Germany to Poland. Next slide, please. Same thing, you have the current Secretary of War, Lord Austin, with the Georgian defense minister. Okay, same thing, sign a deal so you can deploy more troops there. And usually these deals are done under the guise of training. But when we train you, we, in many ways, control you. Next slide, please. Same thing, this one was February 9, 2022, Associated Press. Okay? Moscow invaded Ukraine, and I think it was February 24th, 2022. Okay? And this one was interesting because the U.S. government just pulls money out of thin air. Just pulls money out of thin air. This deal was $100 million we give to Slovakia. Okay? We get to use Slovakia's military infrastructure. In exchange, Slovakia will upgrade some of that infrastructure. Okay? $100 million. What would you do with $100 million? Depending on, literally, it's just like $100 million, Slovakia. This is your government. Next slide, please. Sorry, I get a little non-stop U.S.-led military operations and exercises. So on top of all of that, the U.S. government is leading military operations and exercises all along Russia's borders, all in Eastern Europe. Here are the names, Atlantic Resolve, Rapid Trident, Three Swords. By the way, they also, part of some of this stuff is sending naval warships to places that they used to consider, all right, that's Russia's territory, or at least Russia's, quote-unquote backyard, the Black Sea, the Barents Sea, and now they're all up in there, okay? This is not Russia off the coast of San Diego, okay? This is us off the coast of Russia. Next slide, please. Nukes. The United States government has nuclear weaponry in at least 5 European countries that we know of. Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Italy, Turkey. Okay? And on top of that, they are building new infrastructure in England to bring nukes back to England. U.S. nukes back to England. After the Cold War, they at least took those away. Okay? Now they're bringing those back to England. Okay? So there's going to soon be another country up there. And the U.S. government has repeatedly undermined popular treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Okay? This is incredibly popular. In the UN General Assembly, they're signing it left and right. Okay? Only a handful of countries, with Israel and the US at the lead, of course, are saying no, we're going to work against this. Next slide, please. Almost done, I promise. Provocative behavior. Next slide, please. This is just some clips of what the US has been doing over the last 2 years to Russia. And one of these is excellent reporting from Zach Dorfman over at Yahoo News, who talked about how Trump gave CIA the legal authority to conduct cyber attacks against targets of its choosing when it wants. Okay? So usually CIA, according to the rules of the game, has to go to the White House for repeated authorization to do awful things. Trump says, I'll sign here, You do your awful things on your own time frame, on your own schedule. You don't have to keep coming back. That's still in effect. Okay? The continuity, by the way, in terms of foreign policy, from the Trump administration through to the Biden administration is remarkable. Okay? Next slide, please. Arms control agreements. The United States government under George W. Bush left the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. Then the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019. Then left the Open Skies Treaty in 2020. I can talk about these during question and answer if you want. Open Skies was literally open skies. It was we would fly together, Russian and U.S. Aircraft, military officers would fly together over one another's countries. It provided a little bit of trust, a little bit of openness, and the U.S. was like, nah, we're good, we're out. And the U.S. government, according to, I think it's Reuters reporting, repeatedly has rejected offers from Moscow and Beijing, the other enemy of the day, to establish a ban on weapons in space. Okay? Moscow, Beijing, they say, no weapons in space. The United States government says, weapons in space. Next slide, please. National Defense Strategy. So, the military-industrial complex pivoted to targeting Beijing and Moscow during the early Obama administration. Okay? By 2018, there was enough momentum. This great power competition, as it's called, was etched into stone in the form of the National Defense Strategy. Okay? So now, as of 2018, we are officially going after Beijing. We are officially going after Moscow. Long-term strategic competitions with China and Russia are the principal priorities of the Department of Defense. Next slide, please. The contracts that I studied, you see military and industry working together. Okay? You will never, I've never seen this reported anywhere else. Okay? EPS Corporation and the U.S. Navy developing underwater weapon systems in Montenegro and Bulgaria. Okay? Gomez Research Associates and the U.S. Navy working on detecting IEDs, mines, improvised explosive devices, using drones, and they're doing so in Bulgaria, Serbia, and Ukraine. Again, everything I've talked about is prior to the invasion. Prior to. And then the U.S. has put missile defense batteries in Romania and Poland. These are, I guess you could call them dual use. They are defensive, but they can be, in a matter of hours, changed to be offensive missile batteries. Okay? And the excuse they use is Iran. We're not targeting Russia. We're protecting against Iran because Iran is the bad guy. Iran is the bad guy. Next slide, please. Sales from the U.S. war industry to countries in Eastern Europe. Every single country has been getting weapons of all kinds from the U.S. war industry over the last, well, forever, basically. My lifetime, anyway, except for Belarus. Okay? You get missiles, you get training devices, you get helicopters, you get small drones, you get land vehicles. Next slide, please. Other sales. A lot of Lockheed Martin F-16 fighter jets, a lot of support equipment for that. If you, by the way, when you get a big platform like this, you don't just get the platform, they loop you in. It's like the worst. Think of the slimiest businessman possible, business human possible. Okay? Then multiply that person by several thousand, and then imagine that those people, their business is war. Okay? This is who we're dealing with. This is the military-industrial complex. So they hook you. They'll say, oh, yeah, you'll get an aircraft, but then you get the maintenance, you get the training devices. It's like, yeah, it's the worst possible thing ever. Next slide, please. Ukraine. Next slide, please. U.S. Congress. So you have military, you have industry, and then you have Congress. Congress's job in this triangle, the Iron Triangle, is to pass legislation favorable to industry and legislation that expands military budget and expands legal authorities for the military. That's Congress's role in the military-industrial complex. So it has all these different acts and legal codes that are just ways to funnel more money and weaponry to client states in Eastern Europe. Next slide, please. The White House, same thing. It has something called Presidential Drawdown Authority. transfers war industry goods from U.S. military stockpiles to Ukraine. Okay, and you've seen this as well before and after the invasion. And then the U.S. military has to replenish its own stockpiles. So where does it go? It goes to the U.S. war industry. Next slide, please. Some quotes. We provided more defensive security systems in the past year than any year previous. This was Blinken, who's Secretary of State, in January of this year. But there's no legal distinction in the U.S. government between defensive systems and offensive systems. It's just something they say. Okay? Well, we're defensive security systems. No, it's weapons of war, and that's what it is. Okay? According to the State Department, between 2014 and January of this year, the U.S. government has, quote, State Department's words, committed over $2.7 billion in training and equipment just to Ukraine. Just to Ukraine. Doesn't mention all the other countries that we've been arming and stuff. Next slide, please. Training is absolutely comprehensive. Okay? It goes from the smallest infantry unit in the Ukrainian military to advanced intelligence formations to CAA training Ukrainian forces, including paramilitary, since 2015. Again, excellent reporting by Dorfman over at Yahoo News. Next slide, please. Sales in recent months have included all of this. By the way, the war industry and the U.S. government can classify sales, so we don't even know what they're selling half the time. Next slide, please. They have something, again, called non-lethal defensive items. Okay? All right, yeah. It's basically anything but bombs or bullets, right? So anything that supports warfare but doesn't actually kill can be a non-lethal defensive item. Next slide, please. Excess defense articles, again, just another category in order to sell more stuff. War industry goods sold at a reduced price based on the condition of the equipment or with help from U.S. government grants. The customer, yeah, basically the receiving government just pays for shipping and handling. Next slide, please. Foreign military financing. Okay. If you want loans or grants from the U.S. government in order to buy goods and services from the U.S. war industry, we can give you foreign military financing, loans and grants. However, a few stipulations. One of them, particularly if you're an Eastern European country, is to standardize your military with NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which has expanded since the end of the Cold War. In the words of the State Department, Ukraine has undertaken significant efforts to reform and modernize its defense sector, its military, in line with NATO principles and standards. Next slide, please. So Ukraine is functionally, practically, a member of NATO, even though it is not formally a member of NATO. And that's what Moscow sees as, hey, this is a red line. Okay? You all have expanded NATO right up to our borders. Enough's enough. This is not to excuse Moscow's actions. This is just to provide context. Yeah, the Pentagon has all these talking points that will say we're bolstering the security and capacity of our NATO allies and partners. Okay? Next slide, please. Stephen Semler is a great human. He has his own independent think tank that doesn't take any corporate funding or government funding, and he came up with this chart. Biden's proposed budget, military budget, spends 18 times more on the Pentagon than on climate programs. Okay? War, climate crisis. War, climate crisis. And mind you, this climate spending is more often than not just give away to corporate America for corporate America to come up with some green, whatever, technology that it can say, oh, we're helping on the climate, okay? So this is also, a little love. So if you don't know who Stephen Semler is, look up his think tank. It's called Security Reform, and it's excellent. Next slide, please. I think that's it. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of really important stuff that is in Christian's presentation that is worth kind of reiterating. I mean, there's of course the stuff about how NATO and the U.S. have really provoked this war, and as Christian was just saying, this doesn't justify the Russian invasion, particularly not from the point of view of the interests of the people in Ukraine, in Russia, in the U.S. and really around the world. But within the, there's a logic to how competition between the depraved, wealthy elites from all the different countries, works. And there are some red lines, to that competition between these depraved, wealthy elites from the whole world. Which if crossed will lead to conflict, to military conflict. And I think, this shows very clearly millions of red lines that were crossed, that have been crossed and are continuing to be crossed by the U.S. And this has only gotten worse as billions and billions are being sent, tens of billions, hundreds of billions, I think, to be sent to Ukraine and to far-right neo-Nazi groups like Azov Battalion and whatnot. But also, it really gets at how there's more to it than just the weapons manufacturers or this or that politicians. We're talking about a whole system run by these wealthy elites from all sectors of it, media, government, the various officials within government, the war industry itself, the weapons manufacturers, but also just these big private equity firms that aren't just about the weapons stuff, but that incorporate that into the wider plunder that they carry out in the rest of the world with the variety of other investments. And this all works hand in hand in an interlocking way. And I think that's a key thing for us to really see. And it shows the stakes for our organizing against these moves, against this war, and more generally against this whole war machine and this whole system. So a big part of today, as Anna was talking about, is meant for us to discuss some basic step forwards that we can begin to take in building up mass opposition to the system, to the war machine, and to its many outrages, including this war, but far beyond this war. But before jumping into that, I wanted to just give a few brief remarks on some of the larger dynamics at play that I think are important for us to keep in mind when thinking about how to be building up this mass opposition. And the first thing is that this is this war in Ukraine reflects a much deeper and larger crisis. It's pretty clear from this stuff that this is a proxy war between the U.S., between NATO, and then Russia. But this isn't just some sort of isolated proxy war that happened for some series of long coincidences or something. But it's part of, as Christian was pointing out, a much larger trend of increasingly belligerent competition across the whole globe, not just in Ukraine, between the U.S. as a declining but still very powerful superpower and rival powers that are rising, China and Russia. So in a sense we have a new Cold War that is just beginning to shape up with this and other things. And this increasingly belligerent competition and tendency towards more intense and dangerous proxy wars reflects the crisis in U.S. empire beyond the military aspect, but politically and economically. And that crisis, whenever this proxy war ends, assuming it does end, without all of us ending along with it, this underlying dynamic, leading to this war will only continue to intensify. So to talk a little bit more about this larger dynamic, in particular the decline of U.S. empire, it's very wrapped up with, an increasing incompetence and lack of coordination within the U.S. elite. At the same time that they're making a lot of money, with this stuff, they made a lot of money with the war in Afghanistan and stuff. The people involved in the war industry, these big investors, they've also not been able to accomplish, and in fact they've undermined key strategic objectives beyond their specific pursuit of profit. That could have better positioned themselves, this elite, to overall remain the top dog, which they have to the detriment of the world. They have, remained the top dog for a while. And this incompetence, with Afghanistan, spent trillions of dollars. What did they accomplish other than individually getting rich? They weren't able to set up a client state that could have been, key to countering the influence of China in the region and whatnot. And we're seeing it right now with this war as well. China and Russia have been able to outmaneuver in some ways. Russia, these sanctions, the U.S. plays up, oh, unity, we have unity against Russia, but they haven't really actually been able to get that unity even amongst its own lackeys. There's the BRICS countries that have defied sanctions. India and Saudi Arabia are dramatically increasing Russian oil purchases. Saudi Arabia wants to join BRICS now. Even Mexico, which remains a total puppet of the U.S. in many key ways, is not willing to play along on this, on this front. And there's lots of examples that I don't have time to get into, beyond these that I mentioned. China's inroads into Latin America, which the U.S. sees as its backyard, but increasingly its backyard is not being able to manage it. Those Arab announcements. I really hate to talk about that, but and all of this and this crisis, the increasing incompetence only hardens the belligerent stance of this U.S. elite, since it's an indication of its slipping from its position, the position that has made it, that has maintained its power over the people, the markets, the resources of the world. And along with this kind of geopolitical crisis for the U.S. empire, there's a worsening global economic crisis. I mean, with this war, we see it with the potential for famines, given that Ukraine and Russia are both major food exporters, and a lot of countries in the Middle East and Africa rely almost exclusively on wheat imports from these two countries. There's the whole situation with oil and gas in Europe, but these things are just really intensifications of preceding dynamics that have been at play for a while. The worsening, pre-existing inflation, a result of this depraved elite kicking the can down the road, so to speak, on the long brewing economic crisis by just printing boatloads of money, cutting interest rates, and giving those boatloads of money to the banks to bail out the banks and the big corporations. There's all these supply chain issues that pre-exist this and that are only made more acute by the pandemic and then this war. And so the response to this has, in addition to belligerence abroad, is also increased repression and censorship and propaganda, within the United States. I mean, we've seen, even members of the elite itself who dissent. The dissent is usually, there's not much to it, but even them get labeled as traitors now. And Chomsky made a remark about how he's never seen a more intense kind of effort the propaganda effort and an effort to silence even very tame dissent than with this Ukraine war. All of this I think has to inform us in thinking about the organizing that we want to do and thinking about how to build up mass opposition to the war, but much more broadly than that. We need to take a long and hard look at this overall global situation and the evolving dynamics domestically to chart a way forward out of this mess. And it's no easy task, but hopefully we can take a few modest steps in discussing today. And so a few key things I think is first, this system, it can be tempting to think, that perhaps there's ways to work within the system in some or another sense, whether that be, getting some people elected to office or I don't know, appealing to the better nature of some of these CEOs or something like that, to help. But I think we really have to see that, at least in my view, there really is no recourse within this system overall. That includes the politicians. I mean, we've seen it, like Kristen talked very well about the role of Congress in all of this, and that includes all of these, progressives and so-called socialists who voted to give all these boatloads of money in this war. And there's a little token dissent sometimes right now. It's from this section of the kind of right-wing populists, but and before it was a small section of the Democrats with the Iraq War who kind of played some token dissent, but really there's not much there, and there's certainly not much there with these these big corporations that are making a lot of money from this stuff, and that not only are they making money, but they're engaged in a serious struggle to maintain their basic position. Ruling classes don't let their power slip without a fight, whether that's fight against the people who are rising up against them, or fight against their rival depraved elites around the world. So I think it's important for us to expose expose the various aspects of the system, and including these politicians, whether it be the kind of socialist ones or the supposedly populist right-wing ones, and show how this whole system is working against. Show the people that this whole system is working against broadly against their basic interests, including by beefing up the war machine and the associated censorship and associated surveillance state, etc. And then in connection to that, we need to exposing the million ways that this war machine is tied to the worsening global and domestic situation economically and whatnot, and to the worsening outrages committed by the U.S. elite against the people, domestically at home and abroad, and it makes it very key, I think, for us to break from some of our narrow circles. The anti-war movement, we've been a little bit stuck, I think, with the same kind of circles of people doing the same protests. It's good to protest and stuff, but if it's kind of the same circles and it becomes a bit of a ritual, that doesn't help advance things so much. And particularly, we have to leave the comfortable confines of largely kind of middle-class liberal circles that are involved in this stuff, and reach the poor and working class and other sections of the oppressed sections of the population, including not just the oppressed minorities in urban centers, but also the rural poor, including some of the white and the non-white working class that has been pissed off at the Democrats and has been led astray into voting for Trump or similar types of figures. There's this idea that divide and conquer has been a big thing for the ruling class always, but there's right now a very specific narrative that's being pushed that the main conflict in society, in American society, is conflict between the people themselves. Those holding liberal ideas who vote Democrat, or those holding more conservative ideas who vote Republican. Or various versions of that, and it's an idea that's pushed in somewhat different ways, both by the just explicitly racist right, with the stuff about the immigrants and coming to take their jobs or whatever, but also by the more, I think, liberal sections of the elite, with this idea that it's all these rural people voting Republican who are the problem and stuff like that, and we have to really see that if we're going to build up a mass movement and really reach out of these circles, we have to really challenge that narrative and not take it up, and find ways to connect the outrages as experienced by the various sections of the people to to this war machine and to the overall designs of the U.S. elite. And have some of our organizing be around those outrages. And there's going to be lots of opportunities. I mean, we're already seeing different eruptions of anger and discontent across the world. And the U.S., perhaps is lagging a bit behind, but as the situation worsens globally and domestically, we'll see some of that too. And we'll have to unite with these eruptions and find ways to link the different outrages that they're about to this overall thing and to the war machine, if we're going to build, I think, really a much wider movement against it. So perhaps just one little example, just to get to the discussion. That's not a little too long. I think it would be important to really ramp up work and get somewhat creative about work with veterans. There's a substantial portion of veterans, people who get into the military or come from working class and poor backgrounds, get recruited, have a terrible time, only to come back to collapsing prospects in the U.S. And so there's some section that is quite angry about this stuff, and so if we can reach those sections of veterans that feel this way and get them involved in organizing to reach some of the working class people that are considering this path before they take it. For example, doing some organizing against recruitment centers, involving some veterans, and reaching the kind of the populations that are attempting to be recruited. I think we have to get creative in these sorts of ways. That's just one little example. Anyway, that's enough of me talking. I hope some of this stuff is useful in getting us thinking about how to chart a way forward for our movement against the U.S. empire, the military industrial complex, and I'll pass it on to Anna so we can get going with one step.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Christian and Alonso. We want to open it up and see if anyone has any immediate responses or reactions and go from there. Yeah.
Is there anybody here from Cost of War faculty at Boston University, at UMass Amherst, or Brown? Is there anybody in attendance from those faculties?
It doesn't appear not. It doesn't appear so. All right. There's no other thoughts. Okay.
I just wanted to mention, you mentioned that sociopaths rise to the top of corporations and governments like Russia, China, and Hungary. If you want to get a job at a nuclear facility or missile launch site, they have very careful personality tests, and you have to get letters from people that work with you, and they constantly check your personality to make sure you're not sociopath, unstable, paranoid, or become
I don't think
dangerous.
people can hear you. Sorry.
And yet, to be president of the United States, there's no test at all to see if you're sane or wacko. So that's one thing that would help, especially in the police departments where these really nasty personalities seem to love their job. They love to boss people around, and make bad people do the right thing or something.
I just wanted to, you're saying perhaps discussion, somewhat Q&A, somewhat ideas in the way forward? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So, we have some larger prompts for the discussion, but wanted to see if anyone has kind of immediate questions or thoughts.
I just wanted to make sure my comment was appropriate. Okay, so Alonso, you mentioned this point that really resonated with me, that we're just at the beginning of this new Cold War, and Christian, you mentioned a similar point in your presentation. I think broadly speaking, this is something the vast majority of the American population has not taken stock of. And I think we ourselves involved in anti-war, anti-imperialist movement often fall into a trap. So much, for example, of the discussion around Trump was, now that he's gone, we can go back to normal, back to brunch, somewhat kind of sarcastically, somewhat seriously, people were saying. But look, there's no going back to normal when we're entering into a new Cold War. Even if this, as you said so well, Alonso, even if this war in Ukraine ends without all of us being blown up, and hopefully it will, but there's a real potential of miscalculation or calculated escalation, because people who run this country and people who would run Russia think they can win a nuclear war. They really believe that. That's insanity, but they believe it. But even if it doesn't come to that, the dynamics globally, we're facing the biggest famine in the last 100 years. It'll probably be worse than even the ones 100 years ago, the ones during World War I, that is. We're talking about Germany is preparing heating centers in Berlin and other major metropolitan areas, not just for homeless people, but for average Germans, because their apartments won't be heated and their workplaces won't be heated, so they don't freeze to death. They can go to these during the middle of the day. And that's happening in Germany, one of the wealthiest and most powerful countries in the world. Imagine what's happening around the rest of the world. And so I mention all this because if we're going to organize effectively, we can't have this mentality that oh man, things are bad, let's do a little bit so we can go back to living our lives. We have to see the nature of the system that we're living in. And in particular, talking about the war machine, what sort of situation are we pushing towards? Where the leaders of the U.S. and relatedly in Russia, but in particular the Biden administration plays a huge role in this, have helped to create this crisis globally. I mean, not to mention all the issues you were talking about that preceded this, that many of us, I'm sure, are all aware of to one degree or another. So I hope, the time today, we can keep that in mind and going forward, because like, if we're going to get out of this, we've got to see what the problem is and not believe that it's a quick fix. Negotiations, diplomacy, of course, diplomacy would be helpful, but that's not going to solve these problems.
I mean, you mentioned, Trump. I mean, I've been watching those hearings closely, and I mean, it's a real possibility that he will be running for president. In fact, he's supposed to announce his candidacy, soon. And so the fact that half of America still thinks this guy is just like mom's apple pie is like amazing. And, but people saying, oh well, he was more friendly to Russia. I mean, that is a fallacy. I mean, he said, he was more pro-business with Russia, but we still followed along the line of Russia hatred, and that's when we closed all the during his tenure, many of the embassies, the Russian embassies in the U.S. a lot were closed. So he's not really a friend of Russia. And so the question is, I mean, you mentioned organizing with working class and poor people. I mean, that would be a good thing. But yeah, how do you reach the mass of America? Most people don't care. I mean, it's like, I handed out leaflets and it's like, it was one class, that don't bother me anymore. But I think if you poke them a little bit, they might come around, So,
I think too, just to your point of people, there still being the basis for Trump. I mean, I think it's because, unfortunately, most people don't see like a third way. They see this kind of false duality between Democrats and Republicans, and people are rightly very upset with the way the Biden administration is behaving. I think his approval amongst voters is like at a very low percent. I don't know the exact one, 33%. So even people that did support him, and the larger Democratic Party actually is now wrestling with not having him run again because things are such a mess. And so I think it's really on us to provide something that's independent of that. And it's hard, I'm not saying it's easy, but kind of to reach those people.
right. I mean, it was only the Republicans that voted against sending military aid to Ukraine, but I'm not comfortable working with nationalists and white supremacists. I mean, that's what these people are. It's like,
Right. Yeah, and similarly, the Squad, they all voted for additional aid. And when the war was starting, they published a statement that said, well, we should first have Congress approve anything that might lead us to World War III. I'm putting some words in their mouths, but that's essentially what that was. So on either side, we have this, real dead end.
really, both sides,
Yeah, but they like to portray the illusion that, they're ultimately anti-war, and people like Ilhan Omar coming out to say, we shouldn't be sending all these funds to Ukraine because it's just going to Azov Battalion. But ultimately, she's getting in line with the war effort.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
and so, I think it really exposes what they're about on both sides of the spectrum. I think the binary is false. Yeah.
I saw a video recently that came out in New York, and it was in case of nuclear disaster, either bomb goes off, this is what you do. And I just watched how the video was played out. It was like an airplane security video. And when you got an airplane, it's like, oh, go into your house and duck and cover. And it's like, this is not realistic in any sense. And I thought it was particularly interesting how it was said in the video, don't ask why and don't ask who sent it. Just get in your house and cover so I just thought it was interesting how the media and through the State Department represents a nuclear disaster as if it's just some other natural disaster like an earthquake or something, when just that's obviously not the case. And there's almost a way of like it's obviously a disaster, a huge disaster, but they're like almost trying to make it seem like it's not. They're trying to make it seem like a casual thing that we'll have to worry about. And obviously it would destroy this entire earth.
Just one more thing on that. I actually really appreciate that they put that out. Because the reaction, everybody laughed at it and said this is ridiculous. And it actually got them thinking about nuclear war, which is something that the vast majority of people don't think about day to day, or probably they think about it even less frequently than that, But those little moments kind of reveal that I think the mass of people are willing to hear our message. Because the reaction to that video was, that's ridiculous. That's absurd. Like, how could you even suggest that we just go inside our house and turn on the television and that's your reaction to nuclear war? People are looking for, that tells me that people are looking for a different answer. And that actually gives me some hope.
Just quickly jump on that a little bit. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, yeah, on one hand, there isn't super widespread, consciousness about these dynamics that we talked about and about the need to really oppose this stuff. And but yeah, as you're saying, I mean, people because of people see the overall worsening situation in the country, and it's not so hard to connect, two and two together. It's like, people can see like, okay, 40 billion, 60 billion to Ukraine, and our basic, our infrastructure is falling apart, or our houses are falling apart. There's all this stuff going on that's getting worse. Like, we can't afford stuff in our stores. Like what? And so, I mean, that doesn't itself mean that people are just going to jump into organizing all of a sudden. They're not. It takes us being a bit more creative, and it takes a long-term kind of thing. But we have to be attuned to these things, and to the outrages that people will and are starting to jump at. We have to be aware of those, and be creative about linking those things up that people do take up because of whether it be something like the inflation or whatever it may be, to these larger dynamics and to the war machine. And in that way, once people start taking a stand on some things, if we do a good job and if we're creative about it, we can, I think, get some of those people to be involved in organizing against this.
I just have the idea that most Americans don't give a rat's ass about this. It's business as usual. 20 years of war in Afghanistan. We're still in Iraq. We're still in Syria. We're helping Saudis bomb Yemen. I mean, for the most part, people are just so wiped out by this. They say, oh, Ukraine, well, the only glimmer of hope I see is the military is having a hard time recruiting soldiers. So that's a big thing. I mean, people are getting caught up in that level of getting the military industrial complex and connecting the soldiers to fight the wars. That's where the rubber hits the road. But you have to organize. I mean, Veterans of Peace, we've been out against all these wars since 2001, and the groups have just shrunk down to it. And then we've had Veterans of Peace leave us because they're supporting the war in Ukraine, which I mean, it's hard to believe, but that's how difficult it is. And plus the fact that